Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, and Mirz Hashem today we will be learning Daf Kuf Ayin Amid Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on the very bottom line of Kuf Ayin Amid Aleph with a new Siman Shin Lamed Dinei Yoledes B'Shabbos Uba Yud Aleph Seifim. And I'd like to begin by wishing everybody a Gemar Chesima Tova, a good gebenched yar. Our learning should be schos for Achenu Kobeis Yisrael Hanisunim Batsaru Bashivya Haim Dem Be Bayom Ben Bayabasha Hamakim Yerachem Alehem V'Yitziam Yitzaru L'Rvacha Me'Afela La'ira Mishibud L'Geula Hashta Bagala V'Zman Kariv V'Naimar Amen. Our learning should be a schos for Fu Shalema for Yeshua Levi Ben Ahuva Malkachana Kila Shifra Bazi Lana Udal Yitzchak Ben Sian Ben Dusha Rivka Bas Shiraleh Havadasa Bas Serel. They should all have a refuah shalema b'seich shar chayla Yisrael, and in the schus of the limud HaTorah of Klal Yisrael, we're mispal that the Rebbeinu Shalom should watch over every member of Klal Yisrael b'chol makom shehem. Okay, so a new Siman Shin Lamed Dinei Yoledes B'Shabbos Abayid Al Seifim, the halachas that pertain to dealing with a woman who is giving birth on Shabbos, and here we have 11 seifim. Says the Mechaber Sif Aleph. Yoledes hi kechola sheyesh b'y sakana. The Mechaber tells us, quoting from the Gemara, that a Yoledes has a din of a chola sheyesh b'y sakana, and therefore umechalalin aleha haShabbos, you could be mechal Shabbos for a Yoledes lechol ma shetzricha, for anything that she needs. Let's take a pause here for a second and take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah is cut in Aleph umechalalin. You could be mechal Shabbos for any of the needs of a Yoledes. V'lachein, therefore, says the Chavetz Chaim, min haroi, it would be proper, leisha shehigia lechodesh tishi, for a woman who reaches the 9th month, lahazbin b'chol erev Shabbos kol hadvarim hanitzrachim la. She should prepare anything that might require chil Shabbos. She should prepare it on erev Shabbos. So, for example, we're going to be speaking about lighting a ner for a Yoledes, okay? If a woman is expecting and she's in her 9th month, she should make sure to have the neris that she needs lit already on Erev Shabbos. So, since the halach is that, yes, you are allowed to be Mechal Shabbos for the Yoledes because she has a din of a Chayla Sheyesh Basakana, but still in all, if it's something that could be prepared on Erev Shabbos to avoid Chayla Shabbos, certainly you should do that. Continues the Mishnah Berurah, the Shemni is Daman Leidasa B'Shabbos, because it might come out that she'll go into labor on Shabbos, so have everything prepared in advance. And v'lo titzarech l'chal Shabbos, and in that way, she won't have to be mechal Shabbos. I'll tell you a little bit of a funny story where I live. Years ago, when we were having children, so we would call a car service on Erev Shabbos, and we would tell a car service on Erev Shabbos, look, we might call you on Shabbos that we need a car to go to the hospital, but I want to make some arrangements in advance. So the driver should know that there's going to be an envelope with the money and with a tip at the door, on a table at the door. He should just take the envelope. We're going to need him to open the doors to the car. We're going to need him to take the suitcase to the car and then bring it from the car to the hospital and open the doors, etc., etc. So, one time, somebody made such a phone call on Erev Shabbos. Oh, and so one fellow was making the preparations on Erev Shabbos, and he called the local car service, and he added one thing, and he said, and please, if you could avoid sending me a Jewish driver, because he figured I'm making all of these preparations in advance to minimize Chil Shabbos. The last thing I want is that there's going to be a Yid who's going to show up to do the driving, who's going to be Chil Shabbos. Sure enough, his wife went into labor on Shabbos, so he called the car service, and they sent over a driver. So the non-Jewish driver came, and he took the envelope, and he brought everything to the car, and he opened the doors. And this is in the days before cell phones, where they're in the car heading to the hospital, and the dispatcher calls into the car over the radio and says, hey, did you pick up those anti-Semites yet? So he laughed, and he said, yeah, believe it or not, the anti-Semites are Jewish. But in any case, that's the point of the Mishnah Berurah here. The Mishnah Berurah says a woman who's expecting, and she's in her 9th month, make all preparations that you can to avoid Chil Shabbos in advance, do them on Erev Shabbos. All right, continues the Mechaber. The last word, bottom line of Kafayim and Aleph. So examples of what you're going to do that may entail Chilul Shabbos. Koirin la chachama mimakayim lamakayim. You could call the midwife and let the midwife come, and the midwife could come even if she has to come from outside of the tchum. So the midwife could go ahead and go outside of her tchum and come to take care of the expectant woman. Umiyaldin oisa, and you're actually allowed to assist in the birthing of the child. Now, what Chilul Shabbos does that entail? So interestingly enough, what the Poskim write is that to birth a child is Toilish Davar Mimakim Giduloi. You're separating something from the place in which it grows. The baby grew inside the womb, and the baby is actually attached to the mommy with the umbilical cord, and you're going to birth the baby, separate the baby from the mommy, and then cut the umbilical cord. That's Toilish Bimakim Giduloi. But you're allowed to do this on Shabbos. Umadlikin Ner. You're allowed to light Neris on Shabbos. It's a Daraisa. You're allowed to light Neris on Shabbos. And, says the Mechaber, you're allowed to do this afilu hisuma, even if the mother is blind. So, of what value is the Ner to her? You're still allowed to go ahead and light a Ner. Now let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. So Mishnah Berurah is cut and base. Mimakim lamakayim, you're allowed to call the midwife to come travel. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the chiddush over there is va'afilu bichutz l'tchum. You're even allowed to call her so that she should come from outside of her tchum Shabbos. She's allowed to do this because she's coming to service a yoledes who's considered a chayla sheyesh by sakana. Ice cotton gimel ner. You're allowed to light a ner imhu laila. If it's at night and it's dark, you're allowed to light a ner. Now says the Mishnah Berurah something interesting. Even if the ladies that are helping the woman who's in labor, even if they say that they don't need any light, they're able to do everything that they need to do in the dark. They don't need you to light a ner. Afal pikain, still in all, you're allowed to light a ner. Why? Kimelu lechachamim, the Chazal knew and the Chazal understood. The loy miyasva daita de yoledes kishashruya b'cheshech, that the woman who's giving birth is not going to be calm. She's not going to be settled. Miyasva daita means that her mind will not be settled. Chazal knew. It's very nice that the midwife and the nurses, they all say that they can do everything perfectly fine in the dark. The woman who's in labor is not going to be settled kishashruya b'cheshech if she's in the dark, and therefore you're allowed to go ahead and light a ner. The Kasu b'Taisus Yishanim Shel Yuma, Taisus Yishanim writes at the end of Masechtas Yuma, the Mishabhachi, for this same reason, Afilu Eino Emeres Klum. Even if the woman who's in labor doesn't say a word, she doesn't ask for a ner. V'gama Chachama Eino Emeres Klum, and the midwife doesn't say I need a ner. Nami Madlikin, you're still allowed to go and light a ner. You're allowed to turn on the lights in the room. Why? Because we say that the woman who's in labor, her mind is not settled if she's in the dark, and Chazal understood that that presents a sakana to the yoledes. If the yoledes is not settled, if she's agitated in any way, that poses a sakana. So without anybody asking for a light, you could go ahead and turn on the lights. Now, in Ois Cotton Daled, the Mechaber said that you're allowed to light a ner even if the yoledes is blind. Now that's interesting. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Afa Pisha Bazel Shaykh Taima Hanal. What did we just say in Iskat and Gimel? We said the reason you're allowed to light a ner is so that the yoledes should be calm. But if the yoledes is blind, what difference does it make to her if there's a ner lit or not? The balavach ishruya b'chayshich. Either way, from her perspective, she's in the dark. She's blind. So what value is there in lighting a ner? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Afal Pikein, still in all, Meyas V'daita B'ner Dolok. The yoledes will be more calm if there's a ner lit, even though she's blind. Why? Explains the Mishnah Berurah, the Ka'amra, because she will say, since I know that there's a ner lit, Itzarich namidi, if I need something, chazya chavreiseh va'avdili. The blind Yoledes is calm if she knows that there's a nair lit in the room, because that way she knows that she's going to be well taken care of. She knows that if I need something, they'll be able to do it for me, because they have light. If it's dark, then they're not going to be able to service me properly. Now, when I learned this, my first reaction to this was, okay, wait a second. Let's do the math. We have a blind Yoledes. The heter to light an air is because we want her to be assured that the ladies that are there to help her will be able to properly take care of her. And she needs to know that there's a nair lit. That way she could be confident that they'll be able to do whatever they need. But she can't see the nair. So why don't we just tell her, don't worry, there's an air. Now what are you going to say? It's a sheker? Okay, fine, it's a sheker. Let's do the math. Should we be Mechal Shabbos on an Issa Daraisa and light a nair? Or should we be over on Midvar Sheker Tirchak and tell her, don't worry, there's a nair? L'chari, the math would seem to say, just lie to her. Tell her that there is an air. Don't worry, darling, there's an air. Yeah. Did they turn on the lights? Yup. It's lit up in here like anything. No problem. Everybody's going to take care of you. That's the question that came to my mind. The first answer that I had to the question was that I don't know if blind means completely, totally, 100% blind. Blind might mean that the Yoledis' vision is impaired to the extent that she can't function with the very limited vision that she has, but maybe she could tell the difference between a pitch black room and a room that has a light in it. That was one answer that came to my mind. Another answer that came to my mind was, we know that when somebody has one of their senses impaired, so somebody who's blind, all of their other senses become much more sharpened. So a blind person has a much sharper and keener sense of hearing, sense of smell. Their other senses become sharpened to compensate. A deaf person they could pick up more visual cues. So I was thinking it could be that somebody who's blind, you might think that you could get away with telling them, sure, it's light in the room. But they could sense that people are stumbling around. They could sense that people are feeling around on the table for something in order to find it, instead of just straight away picking it up. So it could be that you can't lie. It's not going to work. You think you can, but you can't. Continues the Mishnah Berurah. There's another chiddush over here, says the Chavetz Chaim. We're being mater lighting the nair to take care of the chayla sheyesh basakana, the Yoledes, but there is nothing inherent in the lighting of the nair that is for refuah. It's not inherently being done for refuah. It's being done just to keep the Yoledes calm. Says the Mishnah Berurah, "V'afa pi dat lakas haner ikara einol refuah, afal pi kein mechalalin." You're still mechal Shabbos to light the nair. Why? The kimlu l'rabbanan the yisuvei daita the Yoledes. The Chazal understood that keeping the Yoledes calm, hu milsa de mistakna ba balav hachi. They understood that a Yoledes could become bisakana if she's going to be agitated or if she's not going to be calm, and therefore you mechal Shabbos to do anything that's necessary to keep her calm, like lighting the nair. And this is something that I discussed earlier on. Whenever you're dealing with a chayla sheyesh basakana, agitation, and you see a raya from it over here, agitation is dangerous, and therefore, if there are things that you have to do to keep the chayla sheyesh basakana calm, you could be mechal Shabbos. Continues the mechaber. The end of the first line. Nevertheless, even though we're saying over here that you are mechal Shabbos for Yoledes because she's a chayla sheyesh basakana, b'chol ma sheyechayla l'shanois, anything that you could do by way of a shinui, if you could do something in an unusual way, that way it will not be an issa daraisa, it will only be an issa darabanan, mishanin, you should make a shinui. And now the Mechaber gives us a couple of examples. Going, for example, im tzrichim lahavi la kli. Let's say you have to bring her a keli. Now, what does it mean you have to bring her a keli? The Mishnah Berurah says, what if she needs oil? She needs oil to anoint herself for some reason. So you have to bring her a vessel. You have to bring her a keli of oil. Says the Mechaber, instead of just being over the Yisad Daraisa, of being Moitzi Mirishus L'Rishus, the Yisad Daraisa of Eitzah, instead of doing it outright, Mevia La Chaverta Talui B'Sa'ara. A woman should hang the keli from her hair. So she's going to be Moitzi the keli full of oil, Mirishus L'Rishus, in a highly unusual way. Now you're doing it klachayad, now it becomes an Issa D'Rabbanan, not an Issa D'Oraisa. Or anything similar to this, you should strive to do it with a shinui. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Mishanin. Now the Chofetz Chaim points out something very interesting right away. He says, if you take a look back in Siman Shin Chav Ches Sif Yud Beis, the Mechaber told us over there that you're allowed to do an Issa D'Oraisa. You're allowed to do Malacha D'Oraisa on behalf of a Chayla Sheyesh B'I Sakana. And over there, the Mechaber does not make any mention of Shinui. So it does not seem that you need a Shinui. So how come suddenly over here by the Yeledes, who we're calling a Chayla Sheyesh B'I Sakana, how come suddenly over here the Mechaber is suggesting that you should use a Shinui? Says the Mishnah Berurah, even though we said earlier in Shin Chav Ches Yud Beis, that by Pikuach Nevesh you do not need a shinoi, you could do Malacha D'Oraisa without a shinoi. Hacha, by Yoledes Shani, it's different. Why? Because of the nature of what we're dealing with. Memnei sheke'ev hayoledes devar tivihu. The suffering of the Yoledes is not an illness. When you see an expectant woman, you don't say, oh my, that woman's been sick already for 7 months. No. And when you take a woman who's in labor to the hospital, you don't say, oh, she's ill, I'm taking her to the hospital. No, she's in labor. She's having a baby. So this is a natural event. It's not a sickness. So says the Mishnah Berurah, this is the natural course of events. It's not an illness. And Baruch Hashem, says the Mishnah Berurah, ve'ein achas me'elef meisa machmas leida. And Baruch Hashem, nowadays, not even 1 in 1,000 dies from childbirth. It's extremely rare, Baruch Hashem, to hear that a woman died from childbirth. Lefikach, therefore, hichmiru ba l'shanos. For that reason, Chazal wa machmir, and they said, or the Poskim were machmir, and said that yes, you are allowed to do Chilul Shabbos on the part of the Yeledes, but if you could do it with a Shinui, you should do it with a Shinui. He brings this down from the Magen Avraham, the name of the Magen Mishnah, and the Meiri. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'chol zeh b'deleka ikov l'chayla. However, this that we're saying, if you could use a Shinui, you should use a Shinui, is only if it's not going to delay the care of the Yoledis in any way. But if it's going to impair the care of the Yoledis, if you're not going to be able to act as quickly and with alacrity, if you do it with a shinoi as if you did it without a shinoi, mitzvah lasos b'lo shinoi, then it is a mitzvah to act without a shinoi, lamaher adavar b'chal kochai, so that you should be able to do whatever you need to do as quickly as possible. Says the Mishnah Berurah Vav, the Mechaber spoke about what if you need to bring the Yoledis a keli. Says the Mishnah Berurah Lahavila keli, why you bring her a keli? Im shemen, she needs some oil, or kahai gavna, or anything similar. So then the Mechaber suggested, instead of doing the Isser of Hitzah D'Oraisa outright, another woman should bring her the keli hanging from her hair. Tali b'sa'ara. Now, what does that accomplish? Explains to Mishnah Berurah, now it's Shaloi Kederech HaMeitzian. Now you're doing the malacha of Hitzah, but you're doing it kalachayad. You're doing it in an abnormal fashion. De'enoi ki im shvos ba'alma. Now it becomes an Issa D'Rabbanan, not an Issa D'Oraisa. So what are we saying? The Mechaber is saying, listen, you are allowed to perform Malacha D'Oraisa on behalf of the Yoledis. But the Mishnah Berurah earlier told us, if you could prepare on Erev Shabbos, prepare on Erev Shabbos, and avoid doing Malacha on Shabbos. Says the Mechaber, if you could do the Malacha that needs to be done with a Shinui, use a Shinui. His example, she needs a keli of oil. He comes up with a Shinui. Let another woman hang it from her hair and bring it to her hanging from her hair. What does that accomplish? You did a Shinui, now it's an Issa D'Rabbanan. Now, says the Chofetz Chaim, V'zeh odif me'im tosoch hashemen b'sa'ara v'tavi etzla v'tischait es haseir. The Chavetz Chaim says, you might have thought that there's another way you could bring her oil. You know what a woman should do? A woman should take the oil that the woman in labor needs and put it in her hair. She should make her hair oily. Take a handful of oil and put oil in her hair and then walk over to the Yeledes. So you're transporting the oil to the Yeledes in her hair. That's how she's transporting it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. It's a much better idea to hang the keli from the hair than to put the oil into the hair. Why? Because the hasam, if you're going to put the oil in your hair and transport it to the Yeledes in your hair, the hasam yika oidi surah de schita. Now you're also going to have to be over the Yisur of Schita. So again, the goal over here is the Yeledes needs oil. The oil is in a different rishus. The oil is in somebody else's house. You need to bring the oil from one person's house to the house of the Yeledes. One way the Mechaber said you could do it is hang the bottle of oil from a woman's hair. She's going to do a haitzah shaloi kederech. It's going to be an issa d'Rabbanan. Says the Chavetz Chaim, you might have thought there's another eitzah. Take a nice good handful of oil, smear it into a woman's hair, let the woman walk to the Yeledes' house. So again, she is transporting it, she's doing haitzah, but that's definitely shaloi kederech. Now you might wonder, is it really haitzah? Yes, it is haitzah, because the oil is not bottled to the woman's hair. So she's definitely doing the malach of haitzah. She's transporting oil from one rishus to another rishus. But she's doing it at klachayad, and it's in a rabbanan. But, says the Mishnah Berurah, this is not a good eitzah, because now what are you going to do when you get to the Yeledes? You're going to have to squeeze the oil out of the woman's hair. Squeezing the oil out of the woman's hair is schita d'Rabbanan. So instead of doing one d'Rabbanan, haitzah klachayad, now you're going to do two d'Rabbanans, haitzah klachayad and schita d'Rabbanan. Says the Mishnah Berurah, da'ava pi de'ein schita b'seir l'chiyuv, even though this is not schita d'Oraisa, because when you squeeze liquid out of hair, that is not schita d'Oraisa. Schita d'Oraisa is only when the liquid is absorbed into what you're squeezing it out of. Hair is not absorbent. When you apply oil to hair, the hair is not absorbing the oil. The oil is becoming trapped between the hairs. So you're not really doing schita. It's not real schita. It's not schita d'Oraisa. But it definitely is an issa d'Rabbanan. So you're doing two issur d'Rabbanan instead of one. Umiyu, however, the Chavetz Chaim says there is one eitzah that is a better eitzah than hanging the bottle of oil from a woman's hair. What's that? Umiyu, if you could bring the Yeledes enough oil in the palm of your hand, that's a better eitzah than anything else that we have discussed. Now this is funny. It sounds a little counterintuitive, right? If someone would be asking you the shaila, there's a woman in the next house who's giving birth and she needs oil. We need to bring oil from this house to her house. What's the better eitzah? To take a bottle of oil and hang it from your hair, or to pour a little oil into the palm of your hand and carry it that way? I think most people would have thought that that's the worst eitzah, putting it in the hand, carrying it in the hand. That sounds like real bona fide carrying, real bona fide haitzah. The answer is that transporting oil in the palm of your hand is still considered haitzah shaloi kederech. It's not, if you're working in the kitchen, you might put a little oil in the palm of your hand. But if your neighbor wants to borrow a little oil, or you want to borrow a little oil, you don't walk over to your neighbor, stick out your hand and say, do me a favor, pour some oil into my hand. That's not the way you transport oil. You transport oil in a keli. So it's still haitzah shaloi kederech. All right. So why is that better than hanging the bottle from the hair? If they're both issur d'Rabbanan, why is one better than the other? So what the poskim seem to say is that if the woman in labor needs only a very small amount of oil, and the amount that you could hold in the palm of your hand would be sufficient, that's the best way to do it, because you'll be able to use all the oil that's in your hand. Because you could actually take your hand and smear it on the woman who's giving birth. So you need to carry less oil. Mashenkein, if you have to transport the oil in a bottle, you're going to have to transport more oil because inevitably some oil is going to remain in the bottle. So if you need an ounce of oil, you're going to bring an ounce and a half. Whereas if you could use your hand, if you need an ounce, you're going to bring an ounce. So you could be memayit in the amount that you have to carry. Okay, let's do one more sif beis. 3 lines off the bottom, Kufayin Amid Beis says to Mechaber. Kutis, and over here, kutis does not mean a woman who's a kuti. It means a nachris. It means an einoi Yehudis. So kutis, ein miyaldanoi sabashabas. You are not allowed to assist an einoi Yehudis in childbirth on Shabbos. Afilu b'davar she'ein b'chil Shabbos. Even if it entails no chil Shabbos whatsoever. Now we need a tiny bit of background over here. There's a Gemara in Masechtas Avodah Zarah. The Gemara says that a Yiddish person is not allowed to assist an Eino Yehudis in childbirth. Period. Not on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. Why? Because what are you doing? You're bringing an Oived Avodah Zarah into the world. Is that Marbek Kvoid Shamayim? To help bring an Oived Avodah Zarah into the world? It's definitely not Marbek Kvoid Shamayim. It's Memayit Kvoid Shamayim. You're bringing another Oived Avodah Zarah into the world. So the Gemara in Avodah Zarah says you're not allowed to assist an Eino Yehudis to give birth. However, Chazal also very clearly understood that especially during the unfortunately lengthy years of Golus, this could be a huge problem, right? Mipnei Eva, the Einam Yehudim are going to become very, very angry at Yehudim if they see that you won't assist them in childbirth. So what Chazal said is, look, if they want you to do it for free, then there's no Eva. If they're not willing to pay, then they understand that you're not going to do it. So if they're not willing to pay, don't do it. If they're willing to pay, then Chazal said you are allowed to do it. Why? Because if you don't, there's going to be Eva, right? If the patient is going to turn around and say, listen, I'll pay you $1,000, I need your help, and you say no, hey, then you have no excuse for saying no, I'm paying you. Why are you saying no? So that's going to cause Eva. So against that backdrop, the Mechaber over here is saying you're not allowed to assist on Shabbos, even if there's no Chil Shabbos. Now, there's another factor that the Mishnah Berurah is going to introduce to us here, and that is that there was another excuse that was considered a valid excuse back in the day of Chazal. One excuse was, if they're not paying, I'm not mechuyev to do it. There's no Eva if they're not paying. Another one was on Shabbos. On Shabbos, Chazal said, you could look at the Eino Yehudis and you could say, look, it's true that I'm allowed to be Mechal Shabbos to help a woman who's in labor on Shabbos. But I'm only allowed to do that for another woman who also keeps Shabbos. She keeps Shabbos, I keep Shabbos. She needs my help on Shabbos. I'm allowed to help her on Shabbos. But I'm not allowed to help a woman who doesn't keep Shabbos. In the day of Chazal, that was considered a valid excuse. Nowadays, it certainly is not. In the times of the Mishnah Berurah, it was not either. But apparently, in the time of the Mechaber, it was. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Kutis Eid Mialden, you're not allowed to assist an Eino Yehudis in childbirth. Afilu b'schar, even if they're willing to pay. The Bechol Mialden, so on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you're allowed to do it. Misham Eva, Kimavur b'Yeridei Simon Kufdin Dal Siv Beis, right? We said that during the week, even though the Gemara in Avodah Zarah says you're not allowed to help bring an Oived Avodah Zarah into the world, but during the week, if they're willing to pay, you're allowed to do it, Misham Eva. Ha-chaser, but on Shabbos, it's aser. Why is it aser on Shabbos? Even if they're willing to pay, it's aser on Shabbos. Why isn't there a problem of Eva? Explains the Mishnah Berurah, because there's another out. V'loi married, you could say, the ein mechal in Shabbos, ki elohudim into Shabbata. There was another excuse, which was, yeah, it's very nice that you're willing to pay me, but it's my Sabbath, and on Sabbath, I'm only allowed to assist another Sabbath observer. I'm not allowed to assist a non-Sabbath observer. Because of Magen Avram, the Magen Avram writes of a makom deikal amechesh le'eva gam b'kai gavna shari imei bachil. In a time and place where these excuses don't hold water, and there's going to be Eva if you don't assist, then definitely if there's no Chil Shabbos involved, you are allowed to assist. There's many tshuvas written as far as nowadays doctors assisting Einam Yehudim, and there are a lot of kulas that are given why doctors are allowed to help even Einam Yehudim. There certainly is a huge problem, a huge risk of Ava, so doctors that have such shilas, they should go ask the Rabbanim that they ask such shilas to, but just we're learning over here, and the Mishnah Berurah is about to write very strictly about doctors who assist Einam Yehudim on Shabbos. You should know that there's a lot written about it, and definitely somebody who has a doctor does need to ask these shilas to a reliable posek who is knowledgeable in areas of medicine and the halachas that pertain to these things. Vedan, you should know, says the Chavetz Chaim, the Roifim is manenu, the doctors nowadays, afilu hayoisek sherim, even ones that are kosher yidden, einam nisharim bazeklal. They're not careful about this. The Ma'aseh b'chol Shabbos, every Shabbos, shenoisim kama prasois l'rapos akum. They go traveling out of the tchum all the time to go take care of a non-Jewish patient. The koisvin, and they write, v'shoichakin, and they grind ingredients to go make medicinal preparations, v'shoichakin samamonim, ba'atzman, isurei daraisa, ve'ein lehem hamashi yismaichu, and they have nothing to rely on, says the Chavetz Chaim. Da'afilim nema demutar l'chal Shabbos b'isat rabbanon, misham eva bein oivdei gelulim, even if you'll say that there are a terim to do isurei darabanon, misham eva, after gamzein oiborer, ayin b'pri begadim, even though that is not clear either, isurei daraisa ba'adei also l'kol yalma. You're definitely not allowed to be over isurei daraisa. U'mechal Shabbos gemurim heim b'mezid. And the Mishnah Berurah says these people are out and out mechal Shabbos b'mezid. Hashem yishmerenu. Now, again, these shilas that doctors have are very, very, very complex. There's a complex shilas. There's a lot to it. And any doctor, it behooves any doctor that is in such a situation where they might have to do either Isurei Darabanan or Isurei Daraisa on behalf of Einam Yehudim, they must ask a shaila from a competent Rav who is very well versed in these areas of halacha. Okay, we're going to stop over here. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Schus of limud HaTorah should be making the ganz Klal Yisrael, the Baruch should send Yeshua's, Refuah's, Parnasset, Shetuchim, to all those in need. We should be zeichet to see the BS God Tzedek b'meher v'yameinu amen, and everyone should have a gemach Siman Tova, a good gebenched year. Be well.